Yeah, so basically, I just wanted to get on here, talk a little bit about kind of topic. I think something's been on my mind a little bit, and honestly, I see it's like a rehab topic where I see this approach being taken with rehabbing powerlifting athletes, and it's kind of annoys the shit out of me, to be honest. I'm not gonna lie, but let me backtrack a little bit. But when it comes to rehabbing powerlifting injuries, there are a couple of different approaches you can take, right? So we'll typically, say we want to make sure we're training within pain levels that are tolerable for the athlete, right? So, typically people will get injured, the lift's painful, so the next step is, okay, what can I do to like get around this injury, right? I just want to work around the injury. And what people can do, you can either reduce load, you can use like a variation, or you can use like a reduced range of motion, right? And that can also fit into using a variation. But what I typically see people do, athletes or even just other people rehabbing athletes do oftentimes, is they'll take this concept of, training within loads that are tolerable, and I think they'll take it a little too far, right? Or they won't like think critically well about like how we're going to approach or what we're going to do, right? Like what exercises we're going to choose. So I'm sure a lot of people have been in this situation before, right? Where they get hurt, let's say they're squatting, low back pain, common like low back pain, right? Squatting or deadlifting, squatting into the hole or deadlifting off the floor is just too painful, right? Let's say typically your working sets are with like 405, right? 105 pounds for your squats and deadlifts are like a typical, good working set for you. But now your back's injured and going full range of motion on either lift is just too painful in that weight range, right? So what you decide to do is, I'm going to drop the load, right? And just kind of drop the load and work in a range that's a weight range that's tolerable. So they'll drop the load 350, still too painful. 315, still too painful. 285, still too painful. 225, okay, cool. I can do 225 for reps. It's tolerable, and I'm going to work it from there, right? So I'll typically see people do is they'll do 225, which is now like 50% of what they typically work with, right? And so what happens is they do 225, 245, they kind of start creeping their way back up, and they're staying in a range that's pain-free, but it's really, really light, right? So eventually they decide, I've been doing this weight, it's feeling pretty good. I'm gonna jump back into 405. Let's go see how 405 feels. They go do a session with 405. Either it's immediately painful or they finish the session, they're okay, I'm good. And then the next day they're flared up again. They're like, man, like what happened? We gotta go back to square one. I'm try again, 225, work my way back up again. And the problem I see with this and why this is probably happening is because while you're doing these light weights, while you're down at 225, you're not really aggravating your back, so your pain's coming down, right? But you're also losing capacity, right? You're losing your training capacity, and you're also not doing enough to really push that stimulus and force that adaptation. So you kind of think about it, right, where you're doing such reduced loads that your training capacity is decreasing while you're going, right? While you're rehabbing, and by the time you get back up to 405, you're detrained. Your pain's gone down, but you actually haven't really improved your tolerance because you haven't been doing enough load. And so what happens is you get back up to that weight and you get hurt again, your pain comes back and you feel like you're back to square one. So that's why, for me personally, when I'm looking at how I'm going to choose a movement or what exercise to do, especially when it comes to powerlifting, because at the end of the day, powerlifters, we want to push as much weight as we can, right? The pain of the game is performing at a high level, lifting heavy weights. So especially with that as the end goal in mind with rehabbing, we don't want to just be pain-free. We want to be pain-free and able to train and lift these heavy loads, right? So for me, what I typically like to do is I'm thinking of, okay, what variation or what can we do to allow for the most load and the most tolerable range of motion, right? Or as tolerable as possible, like do as much load as tolerably as possible. So for me, for instance, in the case of like somebody with low back pain, instead of doing full range of motion and doing 225, which is like maybe 30% of their one rep max, how about we do a box squat or a block pull? And now we can load like 350, 360. We're kind of in that heavier range now. So now we're not going full range of motion, but we're still doing a load that's challenging. And we're going to kind of keep some of that capacity up as well and maintain some of that strength. And then from there, what we'll do is we'll work our way down from that block. So let's say we start with a block that's 2 inches below the knees, right? So from there, let's say they can do 350, and it's like arbitrary, 2-3 out of 10 pain. It's tolerable, right? Cool. In my mind, let's stick there. Let's train there for a while until that range of motion is relatively pain-free, right? Or we're pretty confident in it. Maybe we're even pushing up to that 405 range. Maybe we get back up to 405, that normal range or normal weight range from that block, and it's not painful at all anymore. Okay, well maybe at that point now we drop back down to like a 4-inch block. Right now the block is like 4 inches below the knee, or even like a lower box squat. Right, so we're getting really close to that range of motion, that full range of motion. So the concept there is that as we're working our way back down to full range of motion, we're still pushing loads that are close to what we're used to pushing, right? That way we have there's not just this drastic, we've been doing 225 for a while, let's just jump up to 405 and see how it feels, right? That way, one, you're confident in that, like, well, you know what, I've been doing 405, I've already been training with loads that are close to what I typically do anyways, just in a small range of motion, right? So even then, as an athlete, you'll have a little more confidence in yourself when you go back to that full range of motion. But then even then, from like a capacity and tolerance standpoint, we don't really necessarily have to worry as much about your tolerance to these loads because you've already been doing these loads, maybe just in a reduced range of motion. And then our training capacity, we're probably going to maintain a lot more of that as well because we've been pushing at that higher intensity. And even from a performance standpoint, I've had plenty of athletes I've worked with where, maybe it's like they're having shoulder pain on bench, and they can't do a full range of motion. Like going all the way to the touch point on bench is just too painful, right? And so maybe we do block press or spoto press for a couple blocks. And because we're doing a block press and reducing range of motion, we can still push fairly heavily. And so what typically ends up happening is, when I've seen this happen with athletes that I've worked with, is that once that block press range of motion isn't painful anymore, and we end up going back to full range of motion, there's either very minimal loss in strength, or I've actually seen some athletes, come off and hit PRs coming off of that. And I think just approaching it in this way, in my mind, is a lot better mentally for the athlete, and then also just physiologically, as far as maintaining adaptation, pushing positive adaptation as well. We kind of think, like we say, movement is medicine, right? And if you're being prescribed a medication, there's like a minimum effective dosage, and then there's also too much medicine, right? We can have adverse effects from having too high of a dosage, and then there's also a point where we're taking such a little dose that it's not really doing much for you. And in my mind, when we're decreasing weight so much that we're at like 20% of 1 rep max, in my mind, it's probably not doing that much for you. So that's one aspect of it. And then also for the athlete, I think also just gonna be more enjoyable for the athlete, right? I think whether it's you or you're working with somebody, I know for me, I would much rather, do a pull from a block that's like 70% of my 1 rep max versus doing a full range of motion deadlift, and I can only do like 20%. To me, just personally, I think I would feel better about myself and enjoy training that much more versus being like, yeah, everybody, yeah, I'm only doing 2 reds today. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm just rehabbing though. Doing 2 reds, I'm gonna work my way back up. And so this is just something that I feel like I consistently see. I'll see somebody rehabbing and they're just doing weights that I know like that's not anywhere near what they're used to, like they're normally doing. And then sure enough, they get back up to that like normal weight range and they're hurt again. They kind of just have this cycle of just months and months and months of, all right, well, I'm gonna scale back and then work my way back up. Gonna go back to 20% and then work my way back up to 60 versus maybe utilizing another strategy of just reducing the range of motion, or even just another variation, being able to push heavier. You'll probably maintain more strength, have more fun training, and you'll have a better guideline and even entry point going back into doing that full range of motion lifts comfortably. But yeah, Let me know what your thoughts are. If there's, maybe another way you can think about it or what, but it's cool.